Dean Martin walked onto the stage at the MGM Grand on March 15, 1995, knowing it would be the last time he ever performed. The audience had no idea they were watching a dying man say goodbye. As he adjusted the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, Dean looked out at the crowd and whispered four words that only the front row could hear. "This is it, folks." What happened that night would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Because Dean Martin didn't just perform his final show, he orchestrated his own farewell, hating a devastating secret that would destroy his family when they finally learned the truth. 3 months earlier, Dean had received news that would change everything. But instead of telling his loved ones, he made a decision that would shock the world. He would die exactly as he had lived, on his own terms, protecting everyone else from the pain. The story begins on December 18, 1994, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Dean Martin, 77 years old, had been struggling with what he thought was a persistent cough. His longtime physician, Dr. Michael Goldman, had been urging him to come in for tests for months. "Mr. Martin, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation," Goldman said, reviewing the X-rays and blood work. Dean sat in the sterile examination room, still wearing his signature black turtleneck and gold chain. "Just give it to me straight, Doc. How long do I have?" Dr. Goldman hesitated. In 30 years of practice, he had delivered countless terminal diagnoses. But this was different. This was Dean Martin, the king of cool, an icon who had brought joy to millions. With treatment, possibly 12 to 18 months. Without treatment, Dr. Goldman paused. 3 to 4 months, perhaps less. Dean was quiet for a long moment, processing the news that his lungs, ravaged by decades of smoking, were filled with aggressive cancer. The same lungs that had delivered countless smooth ballads were now betraying him. "What does treatment involve?" Dean asked. "Chemotherapy, radiation. You'd be very sick for the time you have left. The quality of life would be—" Dr. Goldman struggled to find the right words. "Terrible," Dean finished for him. "I'd be bald, weak, throwing up all the time." In simple terms, yes. Dean stood up and straightened his jacket. "Then I'll take the 3 months, Doc. And I don't want anyone to know. Not my family, not my friends, nobody. Mr. Martin, I strongly advise. I've made my decision. Can you keep this between us?" Dr. Goldman nodded reluctantly. "Patient confidentiality is sacred. But please think about telling your family. They deserve to know." Dean shook the doctor's hand. "They deserve to remember me the way I am, not the way I'll become." What Dr. Goldman didn't know was that Dean Martin had already formulated a plan. He would spend his remaining months saying goodbye in his own way, without anyone realizing it. The first phase was settling his affairs. Dean contacted his lawyer, estate planner, and business manager. To them it looked like routine maintenance for a 77. But Dean was methodically ensuring that his family would be taken care of after he was gone. He updated his will, established trust funds for his grandchildren, and even wrote personal letters to each of his surviving children, letters that would only be discovered after his death. The second phase was more emotional, one final performance. Dean hadn't performed regularly in years, but in January 1995, he shocked the entertainment world by announcing a special one-night-only concert at the MGM Grand. The press called it a surprise comeback. Dean's family was thrilled. They thought their patriarch was finding new energy in his golden years. But Dean knew the truth. This would be his farewell. During rehearsals, those closest to Dean began to notice something was different, but none of them suspected he was dying. His longtime pianist, Ken Lane, who had worked with Dean for over 20 years, was the first to sense something unusual. Dean seemed more deliberate during rehearsals. Ken would later recall, he spent extra time on every song, making sure each note was perfect. "I thought he was just being professional, but looking back, he was memorizing everything one last time." Dean's daughter Dina noticed that her father seemed more sentimental than usual. During a dinner in February, Dean pulled her aside. "Honey, I want you to know how proud I am of you," he said, holding her hands. "You've become such a wonderful woman, and I love you more than words can express." Dina was touched but confused. "Dad, where is this coming from? Is everything okay?" Dean smiled that famous smile. "Everything's perfect, sweetheart. I just wanted to make sure you knew." Similar conversations occurred with all of Dean's children over the next few weeks. Each received what seemed like spontaneous expressions of love and pride. but were actually carefully planned goodbye. The most heartbreaking goodbye came in early March, when Dean visited Frank Sinatra. Frank had been dealing with his own health issues, and wasn't performing much anymore, but the two old friends still maintained their friendship. Dean drove to Frank's Beverly Hills estate on March 8th, exactly 1 week before his final performance. "Dino," Frank greeted him with their characteristic bear hug. "What brings you by, Pally?" "Just wanted to see my old friend," Dean said. "Remember when we used to think we'd live forever?" Frank laughed, but there was something in Dean's tone that made him look closer. "You feeling okay, Dino? You sound a little nostalgic." "Yeah, I guess I am." Dean settled into the familiar chair he'd sat in countless times over the decades. "Frank, I need you to know something." "What's that?" "You've been the best friend a guy could ask for. The Rat Pack, Vegas. All those years. They were the best of my life because of you." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Dino, you're talking like you're saying goodbye." Dean forced a smile. "Nah, just getting sentimental in my old age. But I mean it, Frank. Thank you for everything." When Dean left that afternoon, Frank stood at his window watching the car disappear down the driveway. Something felt final about that visit, but Frank couldn't put his finger on what. March 15th, the night that would become Hollywood legend. The MGM Grand was sold out. 2,500 people who had come to see the King of Cool perform what they thought was a triumphant return to the stage. Backstage, Dean's family had gathered to support him. His children were beaming with pride, excited to see their father back in his element. His grandchildren were running around, thrilled to see Grandpa perform. What they didn't know was that Dean had specifically requested this night, this venue, this moment, because he wanted his final performance to be perfect. "Places, Mr. Martin," the stage manager called. Dean took a deep breath. In the 3 months since his diagnosis, the cancer had progressed exactly as Dr. Goldman had predicted. Dean's energy was flagging, and there were mornings when he could barely get out of bed. But tonight, somehow, he felt strong. "How you feeling, Dad?" Dina asked, straightening his bow tie. "Never better, sweetheart," Dean lied. As the curtain rose and the spotlight hit him, Dean Martin walked into the light for the final time. The performance that followed was unlike anything Dean Martin had ever delivered. Every song seemed to carry extra weight. Every lyric seemed to mean more than it ever had before. He opened with "Everybody Loves Somebody," his signature song, but his delivery was different. There was a tenderness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there in previous performances. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Dean said to the crowd. "It's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight. Really wonderful." He performed "That's Amore," and when he got to the line about seeing the moon, he looked directly at his family in the front row. Dina later said she felt like her father was singing just to them, but it was during "Memories Are Made of This" that the audience began to sense something special was happening. Dean's voice cracked slightly on the word "memories," and he paused for just a moment to compose himself. "You know," Dean said to the audience, "I've been blessed to make a lot of memories in my life. Tonight is one of them." Halfway through the show, Dean did something that surprised everyone, including his band. He deviated from the planned setlist. "I'd like to sing a song that isn't on the program tonight," he announced. "It's a song I've never performed in public before, but it means something special to me." The band looked at each other, confused. Ken Lane at the piano had no idea what Dean was playing. Dean walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the audience than he had been all evening. "This song is for everyone I've ever loved, and who has ever loved me." He began to sing "The Way You Look Tonight," a cappella, without any instrumental accompaniment. His voice, still smooth despite his illness, filled the theater with a pure emotional rendition that brought tears to eyes throughout the audience. When he finished, the entire theater was silent for several seconds, before erupting in the longest standing ovation of Dean's career. For his final song, Dean chose "Fly Me to the Moon," Frank Sinatra's signature tune. The choice was deliberate. It was his tribute to his best friend, and his way of saying goodbye to the life they had shared. As the last notes faded, Dean stood center stage and looked out at the audience. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for everything." The audience was on their feet, applauding wildly. Dean's family was crying, not from sadness, but from pride and joy at seeing their patriarch deliver such a magnificent performance. But as Dean took his final bow, Those in the front row saw something that would haunt them forever. Dean Martin was crying too, not tears of joy, but tears of goodbye. As he walked off stage, Dean stopped and looked back one final time. "This is it, folks," he whispered again, just as he had when the show began. Backstage after the show, Dean's family surrounded him with congratulations. The performance had been magical, they said. He was back, they said. Maybe he would tour again. Dean smiled and accepted their praise. But he was exhausted in a way that went beyond the normal fatigue of performing. He was dying, and the effort of giving everything he had for one last show had taken nearly all that remained. "Dad, that was incredible," his son Richie said. "When's the next show?" Dean looked at his son, his talented, loving son who had no idea this was goodbye. "There won't be a next show, son. Tonight was perfect. Let's leave it at perfect." The family assumed he was just being dramatic. Dean had always been prone to grand statements. They had no way of knowing that within 9 months, their father would be gone. The months following the MGM Grand performance were a masterclass in deception. Dean managed to hide his deteriorating condition from everyone who mattered to him. When he became too weak to visit friends, he claimed he was feeling antisocial. When his appetite disappeared, he said he was on a diet. When his voice became raspy, he blamed it on a cold that wouldn't go away. Only Dr. Goldman knew the truth. Dean visited him monthly for pain medication and to monitor the cancer's progress, but he steadfastly refused to tell anyone else. "Mr. Martin," Dr. Goldman pleaded during one visit in November, "your condition is getting worse. Your family deserves to know. They could help you through this." "Doctor, I've lived my whole life protecting my family from pain. I'm not going to stop now." Dean's voice was weaker, but his resolve remained strong. "But they're going to lose you anyway. At least this way, they could prepare. They could say goodbye properly." Dean shook his head. "I said goodbye properly. On that stage in March. That's how I want them to remember me. At my best. Not at my worst." On December 25, 1995, Christmas morning, Dean Martin died peacefully in his sleep at his Beverly Hills home. His housekeeper found him when she arrived to prepare Christmas breakfast. The family was devastated. Dean's death seemed sudden and unexpected. He had seemed fine, tired, perhaps, but not dying. The official cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure, but no one understood why it had happened so quickly. It was only when Dr. Goldman was contacted about Dean's medical records that the truth began to emerge. "Your father came to see me last December," Goldman told Dean gently. "He had been battling lung cancer for a year. He chose not to seek treatment, and he chose not to tell anyone." Dean felt the world tilt. A year, he knew for a year. He was very specific about his wish. He wanted to protect all of you from the pain of watching him deteriorate. "The MGM show," Dina whispered. "He planned it as his farewell," Dr. Goldman confirmed. "He wanted to go out on top, the way he lived." The revelation shattered Dean's family. The performance they had celebrated as a triumphant return was actually a goodbye they had been too blind to see. Dina immediately called her siblings, and they all had the same reaction, a mixture of heartbreak and awe. Their father had been dying, and instead of burdening them with his pain, he had given them one final gift, the memory of him at his absolute best. "Now I understand why he seemed so emotional that night," Richie said. "He wasn't just performing, he was saying goodbye, and we missed it," Dina said through tears. "We were so busy celebrating, we didn't realize we were watching him die." 2 weeks after Dean's funeral, while going through his personal belongings, the family made another discovery that proved just how meticulously Dean had planned his farewell. In Dean's desk, sealed in individual envelopes marked with each family member's name, were letters he had written after his diagnosis. Dina's letter read, "My dearest Dina, if you're reading this, then my time has come and gone. I want you to know that the night at MGM Grand was the proudest moment of my life. Not because of the performance, but because I got to share it with you and the family. I chose not to tell you about my illness, because I wanted your last memory of me to be of strength, not weakness. Every note I sang that night was for you. I love you forever, Dad." Each letter was similar, personal, loving, and explaining his decision to keep his illness secret. But there was one more letter, addressed simply to my audience. In that final letter, Dean Martin had written, "To everyone who came to see me perform over the years, thank you for the gift of your attention and your love. My final performance at the MGM Grand was my way of saying goodbye. though I couldn't tell you that at the time. I hope you remember me, not as a man who was dying, but as a man who was fully alive in the moment we shared. The greatest performance of my life wasn't on any stage. It was convincing everyone I loved that everything was fine when it wasn't, but it was worth it to see you smile one last time. That's Amor. Years later, those who attended Dean's final performance would say they could feel something special in the air that night, though they couldn't identify what it was. Frank Sinatra, when he learned the truth about that final show, wept openly. "That's my Dino," he told Nancy. Even dying, he was protecting everyone else. He was the strongest man I ever knew. Ken Lane, Dean's longtime pianist, kept the sheet music from that final performance. He never played those songs again. They belonged to that night, he said. They belonged to Dean's goodbye. Today, if you visit Dean Martin's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, you'll often find flowers left by fans who heard the story of his final performance. They understand that what they're honoring isn't just a great entertainer, but a man who loved his audience and his family so much that he chose to suffer alone, rather than burden them with his pain. The MGM Grand has since placed a plaque where Dean performed that final show. It reads, "On this stage, March 15, 1995, Dean Martin gave his greatest performance, not just as an entertainer, but as a man who loved his family enough to say goodbye without saying goodbye." Dean Martin's final performance was indeed a goodbye, but it was so much more than that. It was a masterclass in grace, in dignity, and in the lengths to which a good man will go to protect those he loves. He knew he was dying, but instead of making his family endure that knowledge, he gave them one perfect night to remember forever. That's the kind of man Dean Martin was. Even in death, he was still the king of cool.